Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I wanted to thank you again for the amazing turnout last stream. The video is doing quite well, and of course, I'm very, very excited to continue our Snapdragon X Elite coverage. As always, please let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with. We already have some absolute legends in the chat, like our Snapdragon X Elite guy, Inamul, and of course, Evan Rogers, long-term supporter of the show. I am red because I've covered up my windows so the light doesn't blind me. Don't worry, I'm not feverish or anything else like that. It's just I have colorful window covers. Without any further ado, we do have more data now. Now, we have been getting data, of course, all throughout this week, and we had some preliminary data that wasn't too great, in my opinion. Some stuff where we didn't know at what power profile was the chip running. Sometimes we didn't even know which exact version of the Snapdragon X Elite was running. So this is now getting cleared up step by step. There are some disappointing results. I will not deny that. However, there are just some results that I find very interesting, to say the least. So we'll see how the situation evolves. It's still pretty unclear in regards to graphics, I have to admit that. But yeah, let's see basically what happens with the Snapdragon X Elite over time. And now in its launch period, of course, there can be firmware issues, there can be driver issues. We are pretty forgiving of that stuff. That stuff happens to the best of companies. However, I do have to say, some of the hyper positive early coverage that we have received from certain people online, and obviously some of the lesser informed coverage, like our yesterday's reaction to Matt Talk Tech's video, where there were like 5 mistakes in one slide. That stuff, to me, definitely should not be part of anybody's like media work. Even a small streamer like I try to prepare these videos. I try to read up on what is happening. I try to look at different opinions. It's not that always like different opinions will be better or worse, right? Sometimes the prevailing opinion is just the correct one and stuff like that. But to me, this is a complicated issue. I think anybody who is either declaring the Snapdragon X Elite like the best chip ever or already declaring it dead, I think none of those people are doing the situation justice. So let's see basically what we have today. And before I fully start with my coverage, I do want to remind you guys, please subscribe, please leave a like, please comment. I loved how lively yesterday's live chat was. That was a huge delight to me. And of course, share the video to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And if you catch me live and you want to support this channel directly, leave a super chat or super sticker. All direct support is greatly appreciated and is put back right into the channel. And if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can find my link to my Patreon account in the description of this channel. So for one, I do like that a lot of people are trying to like recontextualize the Snapdragon X Elite launch basically in the broader context of like Windows on ARM, right? We obviously had Windows RT, and we had so much stuff from Microsoft trying to make Windows tablets work. And with tablets, the question always is, well, x86 chips out there are not as efficient, not even because of their architecture, but simply because that's not the focus of Intel and AMD as much. They're primarily desktop companies who also make laptop stuff, but these days some companies are even more like server chip companies that do some like regular consumer stuff. And so Microsoft experimented, of course, a lot with Windows on ARM. We know it didn't work out, but well, it didn't work out, then it sort of didn't work out, and then it sort of worked out in small areas. So, and basically it's been an absolute mess. Now this is basically, if this doesn't succeed, I'm fully convinced that Windows on ARM is absolutely dead and buried, but it is one of our most hopeful entries in this saga. However, when people say that like, oh, the Snapdragon X Elite is doing so well for a first generation processor. It is not a first generation Windows on ARM processor from Qualcomm. They had 3 generation of 8CX chips. What the hell are you guys talking about? I just want to say this is like just like M1 was not a first generation like Apple Silicon processor. Like even if you only count the X variants, there were like A9X chips, and like I believe like A8X was like the first really like large tablet variant that Apple built. So this idea that we should treat the Snapdragon X Elite with kid gloves because it's like, oh, it's the very first one, it's just a baby. It's not true. Like, not only is it not true, but it's not productive. That's not how you should ever treat a situation like this. And I do want it, I will react to a couple of videos that we have gotten. Primarily what I do care about is that notebookcheck.net, a great website for a lot of things, has provided us with more in-depth benchmarks about the Snapdragon X Elite in general. Part of it is that they also always have some efficiency numbers next to those benchmarks, which is a huge, huge help. And I really, really appreciate that. And I wish that others were doing the same. We also have on the YouTube front, we do have more coverage for MaxTag, this time focusing less on the actual Snapdragon chip, but more on the new Surface laptop and how that compares with the MacBook Air. And from the Notebook Check guys, we also have a video basically of what they now put in writing. I always appreciate writing when it comes to dry stuff a little bit more. It's just as easier to scroll through than through video, in my opinion. But of course, if you guys have any suggestions of what I should watch, what I should react to, what I should analyze, what kind of data you might have that I might have missed, as always, please let me know. And my other last point is, of course, as always, let me know if the audio quality is working all right for you, what the video looks like, if the stream is doing all right. I have no idea why my microphone is covering so much of my face, even in comparison to yesterday. It's the exact same setup, but I will not be changing anything right now because I'm afraid at that point I'll just kill the entire setup. And the only thing I can do is like I can move it a little bit like that and talk to it through the side, and then I think less of my face is covered. So let's see what Notebook Check had to say. Well, they are talking about that they have the smaller versions, which are the X1E 7800. Great naming, by the way, Qualcomm. We have gone through this last time. There is apparently like an 00 like DE version or something like that that puts this max turbo at up to 4.3 gigahertz, but I haven't seen any actual devices with it out there. It is weird because this list always looked kind of unfinished to me, because I remember Qualcomm talking about like 4 X Elite variants, and then I thought, well, maybe there were like 4 X Elite and like 3 X Elite and 1 X Plus variant, but no, there is a 4.3 gigahertz version. I just have no idea where it is, if it might be so inefficient to boost that by another 100 megahertz that it's just embarrassing, right? Like maybe it kills efficiency so much. But part of the issue with having those two chips as the main representatives is this: you can see that they like lag behind this chip by almost a full teraflop, right? So they will have dramatically less GPU performance, and this already ain't great. Like we saw some results for the 8400 and its GPU, like basically M2 level at the time when M3 is already out, M4 is already out. Now they do kind of get the advantage of M4 not being yet on MacBooks, right? But M4 exists. If I am not here to discuss if the Surface laptop is a good deal, if whatever kind of VivoBook is a good deal, I am here to discuss if this actual processor is kind of like worth the hype that as I covered it yesterday, was like a 9-month baby in the making. Evan Rogers, I'm not shocked that all of the reviewers are basically ignoring the very real compatibility issues and bugs with ARM and Windows. If Apple released the M1 software support this poor, yeah, I remember like the coverage where like M1 MacBook Airs and stuff like that got like 9 out of 10s across the board, some even 10 out of 10 reviews, and people were saying like, wow, all my software freaking works, right? And there wasn't like a year setup to this, or like, I mean, yeah, it was a little bit longer than usual with Apple Silicon, but it wasn't like what we have here. So it just bothers me that like people are saying like, oh, Premiere will like get an ARM update, or this app will get like an ARM update, but then they're also like, well, gaming is not the focus of this chip. And I'm like, fine, but like that, you can say that about the raw performance, but when you actually think about it, around 4 teraflops, that's like, sure, you can like, it doesn't have the bandwidth of like an Xbox Series S, but if you try to run games at 720p, that's plenty of performance for like even like 60 fps gaming, sometimes definitely like 30 to 40 fps. So my question is like, okay, it might not be a gaming monster, but I still need to see proper tests to see if it's compatible with games, right? I can accept that it might have issue with some multiplayer games that like don't like new processors because they immediately think there might be some cheating involved or whatever. But when it comes to stuff like just knowing, well, how well does it run like an older title like GTA 5 or whatever, right? Which all Android guys are currently emulating on their phones with Snapdragon 8 Gen 2s and Gen 3s. I'm like, I think that's interesting, and I think that's relevant. How does it work with CS2, for example, or Dota 2, right? Some of the biggest always played games on Windows, and some people only play those games, right? If you get at least this chip to run it pretty well and without major compatibility issues, that's all it takes. And then, of course, we have shit like Handbrake, other like productivity video creation tools, and somehow we barely get anything, right? So that's a bit of a shame. But we do have a little bit more these days. Yeah, by the way, this is the variant I was talking about. Like this, I have no idea where it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe it will be like used as like an extremely like the way that Intel treats like their K versions or whatever, or even more like their KS versions. I think that's what they're called. I haven't paid attention to Intel as much in the last year as I used to. I used to watch like every hardware unboxed video and stuff, and every Gamers Nexus video, but ever since they like went from 12th to 13th gen to 14th gen, I just lost most interest. So this basically feels like a completely overclocked version. This is such a small boost, and I'm very happy that Apple is refraining from doing anything like that, where like single core is single core on all Apple devices, right? You might get a small boost from the Pros and the Macs because of better cooling and a tiny bit more like bandwidth, even though the bandwidth for one single core shouldn't be that different. And you might get then small differences there, but like here, like this is like a 2% difference here. That's laughable. Like you cannot even give us a slightly better GPU at the same time. And then like you have this variant where like, well, it's 3.4 gigahertz. It cannot boost at all, which is weird because like any chip can boost, even if it's like very poorly binned. Like at least like give it like 3.8 gigahertz or something like that, and then or leave it out to the freaking manufacturer, right? If those chips are like, they're identical, right? They have the NPU, they have the same GPU. I don't know if like the GPU is binned from here to here or if it's just like lower clocked. It still has all 12 cores, right? It's not like DX Plus. like I'm asking, like, why wouldn't you leave that to like the manufacturer and say like, okay, you can basically like this is the cheaper version, right? It boosts up to 4 gigahertz, but maybe if you want to build like still a super thin and light, you can only boost it to 3.8 gigahertz if you choose to, or whatever, right? It's up to you. What matters to us is that you reach like the 3.4 gigahertz multi-thread frequency, right? But because they want to like nickel and dime those manufacturers, because they obviously have to ask for such a low price that every dollar on top matters, they have to say, well, if you want a cheap Snapdragon X Elite device like the VivoBook S15, you have to get this with performance that will underperform like the M2 in most tests. Never mind the M2 Pro or anything like that, and forget any relevant competition to the freaking M3. So what is the point of this chip at that point, right? Like this is like a marketing gimmick to me. This chip and this chip to me shouldn't exist. There should be like 2 chip variants. One is like higher binned, higher clocked, has the full GPU enabled, and the other has less GPU and clocks a little lower. I think that would be plenty fine. This is in many ways what Apple does, and it even would be more similar to what AMD does, but AMD always makes their lineups like also too big in the end, so I cannot praise them too much here. And they also have weird naming schemes like Ryzen AI 300 or whatever. But yeah, so I just wanted to briefly cover that. Unfortunately, we will not be analyzing benchmarks for these two, which, as I've said yesterday, are the more interesting chips. I'm not denying that, but we are taking what we can get. Hamadil Ali Hamad, I think. I apologize if I butchered your name in any way. Hello, welcome to the stream. I don't think I've ever seen you. And yeah, now that some time has passed, like a lot of people tuned in, I just wanted to tell you guys again, please be super active in the chat. I love that. You can see I really respond. Sometimes even if you don't send it as a super chat, I will still respond. So please be engaged. That helps me be the best streamer I can be, and I think it will make the most engaged stream for you too. Now, there are some positives, I won't deny that. For one, every X Elite comes with 16 gigs of RAM, right, as base, because partially to power like Microsoft's Copilot thing, you really wouldn't be able to run both Windows and Copilot and any number of like normal apps on an 8 gigabyte system, right? Then you can configure up to 32. It does support up to 64, though I haven't seen yet configs like that, and it supports the latest versions of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, because obviously Qualcomm does make their own modems, and Apple is at Wi-Fi 6E. These guys are at Wi-Fi 7. I believe Apple will probably upgrade to Wi-Fi 7 on M4 MacBooks. They didn't do so on the iPad Pro, but if the MacBooks still need like 4 months or 5 months to come out, then I do believe that it would be very much time and prudent for them to come with Wi-Fi 7. We have discussed the layout in terms of like it being 12 cores. I've seen some people say, oh, it has like an efficiency cluster, right? I don't like that term, because to me, like, efficiency cores should be a separate design, right? What we basically have are like lower clock cores there, and that is obviously not anywhere near the same. I apologize, my MagSafe just disconnected. Maybe I should go back to charging everything over USB-C. I was never a fan of MagSafe, though I think maybe it's my fault, because 2 days ago I actually did the meme, right? The MagSafe cable meme, where I ran over it. And basically, if it would have been like a plugged-in USB-C cable, which it was plugged in into my MacBook, but it's just magnets, and the cable flew away, right? And instead of taking my MacBook with it. So this is why I'm charging with a MagSafe, because I am worried about something like that happening. But MagSafe always had like weird stability issues, for, at least for me. Qualcomm should have simplified design and SKU variants and released this SoC in 2022. Well, yeah, but I don't think it was ready in 2022. They should have like at this point, I'm really, really worried though about what Qualcomm is doing, because if ARM keeps making like stuff like the X925 core, right, 925 core, and it's like optimized for 3 nanometer. It's the latest version of ARM v9, which also means that it will get all the advantages of like scalable metrics executions, what people complained about on like the M4. And it's not that I believe that it will be fundamentally better than Orion cores and stuff like that, but I feel like we are looking at yet another fragmentation potentially on the market, where Samsung was like planning on making their own core designs again, maybe even potentially making their own GPUs, which they partnered with like AMD now for their mobile devices, but supposedly they're looking to enter the desktop GPU market. I fully believe they're only saying that to like appease shareholders, because Nvidia just became the world's most valuable company. It's like a meme. It keeps going up by 2% every day. It's ridiculous. But like, and then we have like the disparity between like Qualcomm now has Orion cores, but they're like a generation behind or more, not in terms of raw performance, but like the raw architecture. And now we have the ARM stock design. Of course, we have Apple's own designs. And I kind of wonder what that means for like proper optimization, things like that, right? There is a reason, like beyond just the fact that obviously big companies have more money and can price out smaller companies, but there's a reason why Intel and AMD are like the 2 desktop CPU companies. There's a reason why Nvidia and AMD are like the 2 desktop GPU companies, and even Intel has like issues entering that market, properly optimizing drivers, things like that. I just wonder what will happen. Like, yeah, so like Orion, for example, is ARM v8.7, which, given that Apple is now at ARM v9, and given that Qualcomm used to be on ARM v9, that's just such a funny thing to consider. I think it's DOA because they gave x86 too much time to catch up. Well, yeah, of course, if they had been capable of releasing a chip like that in 2022, of course, they would have done it, right? This isn't even like hindsight is 2020. This is just like, oh, if I had like magical time travel abilities. The issue though is like their promises were always unrealistic, right? They compared this chip to like an M2 processor, which at that point was over a year old, and after they presented the X Elite, DM3 came out, and before X Elite devices came out, we actually got the M4. And of course, like it still doesn't come. It still is behind like Intel's and AMD when it comes to GPU performance. Now both of them are like scarily boosting GPU performance on like Strix Points and Lunar Lake, and Intel is finally like jumping to an actual new node like N3B for Lunar Lake, to a degree Intel 20A on Arrow Lake. And meanwhile, Qualcomm is like in the middle of 2024 and going like, yeah, we have a 4 nanometer chip. We don't even know if it's N4P or just N4. And yeah, Qualcomm and yeah, AMD is like doing the same thing, but AMD has the advantage of already being a household like Windows like chip name, right? And they will also I fully believe that AMD would have launched a 3 nanometer chip if they weren't like so eager to just gain more market share in the server space. And I believe all their 3 nanometer orders are going to like Zen 5C, like 192 core chips for the servers. Yeah, so it basically leaves like Apple right now completely unchallenged in any kind of like efficiency focused way. So that's a bit of a shame, because that's not what I want for the market. Then we have all the like clock frequency like variants, which also brings up the question like, can your device even clock as fast as like as what is advertised for the specific chip, right? We talked about like the Galaxy Book Edge technically having, well, not even the highest end version, which would be this 1DE, but like technically having like this faster version, the 84-100, but it then not being able to like sustain those clocks in any way, and then often underperforming a Surface laptop with this variant. Outside of GPU, of course, then it wins. But now you're like, well, do I pay more for a device with a 20% faster GPU if that GPU doesn't even have like great compatibility with everything on Windows? Yazin saying Lunar Lake will compete with Apple Silicon in efficiency. Bro, I don't have a problem with that. As I say, I do want more competition. The issue is Lunar Lake, they said now it's coming out in Q3, which I assume means the very, very end of Q3 or like October. Would that still be like, or I guess very late September? Maybe, but that if that launches at that time, then it will be a paper launch. And I understand it has like an N3B die and an N6 tile, which are combined. But the problem with Lunar Lake also is like it's a 4+4 design, right? It's like 4 performance, 4 efficiency cores. It's like DM4 already is a 4+6 design, and by all accounts, DM4 might even beat it out in GPU performance. Like this is the issue. Like if you come out so late, you really have to present us with something extra, in my opinion. Now, I understand that like Apple is not like super directly competing with Intel, right? In the sense that Intel, neither side has to beat the other completely, like objectively, because then you still have all the all the different. Why am I using the word disparity so much? All the differences between like, do you like Windows? Do you like a focus on gaming and whatever? I personally believe that Arrow Lake will be like a more interesting like design, because this is where we'll also get like something that might compete with an M4 Max. We might get like a what would it be, even like a 24 core laptop chip potentially out of like 8 performance and 16 efficiency cores or something crazy like that, or at least like a 8+8 design fully. So yeah, again, I'm not trying to downplay those chips. It's just that it's still like a month until we get Strix Point, which is to me absolutely fine. For example, to not buy the X Elite in the expectation that like, oh, Strix Point is just around the corner. But when it comes to a Lunar Lake, that one is further away, and that one does not play in the same performance league, just to it having a lot fewer cores. So that's right. This is why Apple, in a weird way, at least with the M3 generation, they then made it more confusing by introducing an M4 iPad Pro. But like Apple had like the most cohesive launch ever, with like launching M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max simultaneously. And I wish they had done the same for the M4, because nothing would come close. Yeah, the X Plus, I haven't yet seen tests for it. And the big problem, which I'm very glad that they are bringing up, is that there is a huge wattage range for the X Elite SoCs, which I haven't yet seen anything that technically goes up to 80 watts, but I also haven't seen anything that really goes down to 15 watts, right? You can get the chip to maybe be 15 watts, but once you account for like the power consumption of basically the rest of the motherboard and whatever, and like multi-threaded task, maybe jumping up from the background and hijacking a little bit of your SoC, now you're definitely not at 15 watts. So this idea, like the reason why it was ever mentioned that it could be like 15 watts, it's very simple, and that's because that's sort of where like the base M series chips operate, right? They used to be like as low as 11 to 13 watts. Now they go up to 18, 20 watts. Then the Pro versions go up to like 30 watts. obviously, if you combine both CPU and GPU, you can go higher still. And then the max chips are like 50-watt chips now. So it's funny. Like, I would love to see the absolute highest possible power consumption between like an M3 Max and the X Elite, maybe like this version, that overclocked version, and what that results in terms of performance. If there's actually like meaningful scaling still, if you try push an X Elite to like 80 watts. I personally don't think it will scale well beyond 50 watts, but it's interesting, right? So this is the VivoBook S15 OLED, unfortunately powered by the worst version, but that obviously comes with the benefit of it being very cheap for having a high quality display and 1 terabytes of base storage at $1,300, and Microsoft Surface Pro OLED, which I don't even know the base price for it, but it's pretty high. It's more expensive than I thought, as is the entire Surface lineup, but obviously Apple's devices are also expensive, so I'm not dissing on Microsoft in that way. I'm just saying that obviously in the Windows field there's some other price consideration than in the Mac field, because if you want a Mac you don't really have much of a choice. In the Windows field you do have a lot of choice, like even just between those two devices, like OLED, X Elite, but slightly different. But then you have like the integrated keyboard and trackpad, where you have to here spend like $200 more, and then this comes like with 4 times the base storage and things like that. So I'll just want to say I'm not making a judgment here on the value of individual products. I think there will be time for that, especially as we get a fuller lineup. Right now it's basically like a discussion between like 3 or 4 devices right now: the VivoBook, like the Surface Pro and the Surface Laptop, and the Galaxy Book Edge, right? So there aren't that many devices for us to have a very like broad understanding of what the X Elite lineup will look like in the Windows space. But it definitely, like on the premium side, like the premium build side, is kind of like rivaling Apple's prices, which definitely isn't great. But then you can go cheap, right? And then now you have to ask though, like, oh, you get like a nice OLED screen, but it's paired with terrible speakers. The trackpad isn't anywhere near to Apple standards. The backlight of the keyboard is apparently trash. So there are like those small things that don't show up really on a tech specs thing, but list, but they definitely show up in the general user experience. So if you are somebody who really just wants to downplay the Surface devices, I actually have to defend them a little, where they are relatively well built. They have like extra fancy stuff like the Microsoft Surface connector. And if you go for like the Surface Pro, I always believed that Microsoft had like amazing kickstands for their Windows tablets. So the situation is complicated, but it wouldn't be unruly if like the device, if even like all those variants existed, but each of them had like a really, really great like proposition. Like this at least makes the point that like, oh, I'm cheap, get me, right? And this one sort of should be making the point, well, I'm powerful, get me. But as we'll see, that isn't necessarily the case. So they switched to Cinebench 2024 here. As I said also in my last video, and I believe I've said it time and time again over in my channel, that Cinebench R23 is complete garbage at testing anything related to ARM silicon. It's still not great with 2024, even though Apple wins, right? I will still say it's probably not great overall, but it's definitely way, way better and definitely more usable. That being said, I always want to point out that Cinebench is a benchmark based on the app Cinema 4D, an app that is primarily used with GPU acceleration these days. So why it became like a CPU benchmark, quite honestly, I don't know. Yeah, so they, as always, we do start with Geekbench, which I apologize. We do actually start with Cinebench, but we do have Geekbench 6.2 here for some reason, not 6.3. Again, weird differences, but it should be noted that M3 doesn't really benefit from 6.3 the way like M4 does. So there's like no foul play here at work. In Cinebench, the Apple M3 is the fastest single-core chip on the market, giving you up to 40% more performance than a Ryzen 7 8845HS, which, yes, if you actually think about Strix Point, which should be like 15, maybe 20% faster than this, it will still not come close to the M3. And if you look at Intel Core Ultra 7, that this is a Meteor Lake part, Lunar Lake could beat, in my opinion, will definitely beat Strix Point, which should be like at 120 or something like that. But I don't think it would come close to beating the M3 necessarily, which is, of course, funny because now we have the discussion that Apple does have a chip that is like 10% faster than that easily in many ways. So that will, of course, be quite big with like an, even if we ignore like the IPC uplift through things like scalable metrics extensions, you still have like an 7% increase in clock speed from M3 to M4, and then you also have like an 8% general IPC uplift. Even if you ignore the SME results in Geekbench, so that one should go up to like 160, maybe more. So even if like Lunar Lake suddenly comes up to 135 or something like that, that doesn't look too good for the rest of the industry, which is hilarious given just how bad Apple's chips looked in Cinebench R23. Yazin Willy, what is the efficiency per watt? What's matter? And this is what Apple is good in. Exactly. And it's not just that performance per watt is great because performance per watt gives you battery life, but performance per watt is performance, right? Because if you have like a power constrained or thermally constrained device, the fact that it's super efficient actually means that you get a lot more potential performance at any given time. You don't have to worry about like your like turbo boosting your device, which I hate that that's as a term, because in my opinion a boost should be just a boost, and it should be like working in conjecture with everything from like your device cooling and stuff like that. It shouldn't like even be, in my opinion, bound to any mode of like, oh, you need to enable the high performance mode. It doesn't work in the balance mode, right? Because obviously these results, you could, of course, those results will probably be like at 130 points or something like that. Once you go with the highest end variant, maybe they might even approach this. But then you also still have to consider, well, at what mode am I running in? Because when you then look at Geekbench, well, for one, the M4 easily goes up to 3800. There are tests where it goes close to 4000, but let's put it at 3700 to be nice to everyone else. So you see a 20% increase here. And then we have the Snapdragon X Elite, which is a good single core result. It's quite close to the M3. Which is interesting here is that technically the 8400 should be like higher clocked even than the 8100, but we don't really see like higher than 2900 results from the 84 either. Maybe that's a result of it being like bound to the terrible Galaxy book, but it seems like this is probably the highest we'll see, and it will most likely not reach this, but it definitely has no chance in hell of reaching this. And then yes, if we compare it to like M2, this is where we like finally get Qualcomm overtaking Apple. This is why Qualcomm was so interested in showing the X Elite before the presentation of the M3, but now they live in an industry where not only the M3 exists, but also the M4. And if you want to compare it to like the M1, which I hope that search works well. Nope. Like I just put it in with a MacBook Air. MacBook Air M3, M1, that's the entry model. if you look at it in single core performance, you can actually see that this is, by the way, where performance per watt comes in, because given like Meteor Lake's architecture, I fully believe that you could get higher, but it just is like unrealistic for a laptop. It just would kill thermals, kill battery life completely, and this is why an M1 and at this point 3.5-year-old chip can still rival what is technically still the latest mobile Intel chip on the market. Now, this is from those numbers we can also ascertain like just how efficient those chips are, and this is where we get a monumental leap over the current x86 chips with the Snapdragon X Elite. This is where I absolutely have to say I'm very glad to see that. This is in Cinebench. I don't even know if Geekbench is like it's like very good at for you to evaluate efficiency because it's a short test. But yeah, with Cinebench, this is external monitor, so it will like not account for like a device's like internal screen and something like that. You can see that when it comes to performance per watt, obviously the M4 is even more efficient, but the Apple M3 is almost twice as efficient as the Snapdragon X Elite, and it should be noted that those are the lower power versions, which means they sit more advantageously on the performance per watt curve. I wouldn't be surprised if we compare like the slightly higher performance of an 84-100, but then also the lower efficiency, that we then suddenly get into a territory where it's like around 6 points per watt or something like that. The reason why efficiency can go up from a lower end variant to a higher end variant sometimes, that will come from like better utilization and stuff like that. Also like small differences between how they're implemented in devices. That's usually not the case. Usually running at a lower frequency puts you more better on the performance per watt curve. By the way, guys, we have now been streaming for almost 40 minutes. I want to remind you again, please, if you're enjoying this, please subscribe. It helps out tremendously to grow the community. Leave a like. That helps a lot with the algorithm. Share the video to anybody who you think might be interested. Comment both while I'm live, but also when the video has already been uploaded. That, of course, also helps a lot. And if you really insist on me reading out your message, or you just want to support this channel directly, leave a super chat or a super sticker right while I'm live, or subscribe to my Patreon. Link is in the description of this channel. Again, if we actually add the M1 to that mix, the reason why I'm doing that is pretty simple, and you will see that right away. So MacBook Air, oh, they don't have the numbers for the efficiency here, but basically what you would see is that the M2 and like M1 are around here, and that wouldn't even be too surprising, because now we're talking about like 4 nanometer ARM, 4 nanometer ARM chips, versus, yes, this is 4 nanometer. This is a little bit of a mess because it's partially Intel 4, partially TSMC 5 nanometer, partially TSMC 6 nanometer. But you can see the difference here between ARM and x86. Now, I always say the efficiency of a chip is not primarily defined by its like underlying architecture. However, there should be noted that ARM cores in the last few years like definitely have been tailored towards like a lot of like a higher efficiency in general. That's just what they're built for. The engineers obviously leveraging the risk nature of ARM chips here. That does not mean that x86 is completely incapable of reaching those efficiency numbers, but it's pretty unlikely that it will do so given the trends that we have seen from Intel and AMD. That's just not their main focus. Primarily, for one, they won't put as much cash on their like main die often, because obviously they have to sell like their chips even to like the desktop market. At that point, it just makes way more sense to overclock that chip to oblivion. And even if you want to add more cache, AMD does that with like a separate cache die with their Vcache chips. that sits on top. It then reduces overall like potential highest clock speeds, but it also improves efficiency a lot. Unfortunately, we haven't yet gotten a chip like that for mobile. Some people speculate that it's because it like traps thermals a little, which would make it worse for mobile. But that is weird because on desktop it doesn't actually need more thermal it doesn't actually need better cooling. It's actually so much more efficient that it needs dramatically less cooling. So I just wanted to point out, like, don't shit on x86 the way that like Vadim from like MaxTech usually does, and he says like, oh, x86 is doomed or whatever. But there are definitely some advantages to like modern RISC-based processors versus modern x86 based processors. Now, when we look at multi-core, this is where obviously nothing comes close to the M3 Max. Wait, what? Oh, that's Cinebench, unfortunately. If we look at Geekbench, I think that these results are way, way more representative. And I always say that obviously the M3 Max here is not even like as aggressive as I think Apple could do. If Apple optimized this for like an 80-watt design or even like a 100-watt design, which is what we often would see on like which would be here, not those are all like SoCs, but like if we look at like the 14th generation like laptop chips, that is usually where they would be. Like we would have the CPU potentially using up to like 60, 70, 80 watts or even 100 watts in like peak, and that is definitely not the case for the M3 Max. What is absolutely astounding is the multi-threaded performance of the M4. Again, Apple could get even more out of it, but that would impact efficiency because obviously this chip was like optimized to first come into the 5.1 millimeter iPad Pro, and absolutely like amazing feat, even with a 3nm design that was never guaranteed. And then Qualcomm obviously does give you like potentially matches like M2 Pro multi-threaded, M4 multi-threaded performance, M3 Pro, but the question is like, well, what's the wattage? And the wattage is like significantly higher, and this is why we have a follow-up graph here, which unfortunately does exclude the M4 because they cannot evaluate the data for power consumption on the iPad the same way they do on the MacBook. But yes, the M3 obviously having like over 20% more additional, 25% to be more precise, higher efficiency than the X Elite, which does go beyond the efficiency gains of the Note, right? A lot of people will like always say, well, that's because this is N3B versus like N4 and 5P, but the difference there would be like 10, maybe 15% at most. And also like the way that M3 is like a tad too highly clocked almost. Like where's the M3 Pro here? Because the M3 Pro has more cores, so it can put like more load onto its efficiency cores proportionately to like the overall performance it puts out. But obviously no chip here comes close to the efficiency that an M4 with its 4+6 core design and reaching almost 15,000 points in Geekbench multi-threaded does here. Does that benchmark actually change? Oh, so they do have, and they also only have the efficiency for Cinebench, which, as I said, Cinebench is still like a little bit worse, especially for Apple, because Apple just doesn't bother to optimize as much for Cinebench as everyone else does, because Apple does not build Windows PCs, so they don't care about like the most popular Windows PC benchmark. That's just not where they are. But I do like this data. I wish it was Geekbench 6.3, even if it wouldn't change anything. I just would feel more comfortable having the latest results. And yeah, then when you actually look at multi-threaded performance, you can see that like the 845HS, you can feel that this is where 4nm comes in. And if you really like balance the load across the chips, this is where it really like competes. And this is where I really worry about the X Elite, because if you think about it, this is 8 performance cores. Strix Point will be 4 performance and 8 efficiency cores, so 4 Zen 5 and 8 Zen 5C cores. So So in my opinion, it will very, very likely, at least in this specific benchmark, in this specific calculation, I believe Strix Point will win. And yeah, you can see that the efficiency of the VivoBook chip right inside is just terrible for some reason. And of course we do have like the different modes between like best performance and whatever. I hate that shit. I wish there was like one default mode and then you could maybe tune it a little bit, but like the default balance mode unfortunately will mean that you like this is the problem, right? If you go balanced, that means you won't reach the single core results that you look at. But if you go with highest performance, that means you won't reach the highest efficiency numbers that we have seen. So yeah, it's a little bit of a mess, this is also interesting where it's like the Surface Pro has like the best efficiency and best performance mode. I have no idea what happened there. Like, yeah, it might just be that the way the motherboard and stuff like that are designed on the Surface Pro are just more efficient than whatever is on the VivoBook. But yeah, I'm just surprised to see that. Now we get to 3D Mark. This is where it gets interesting because 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme is a garbage test, and this is why for the first time in this video I would like to react to something actually, which is well, not fully, but I will take some parts of it, which is I'll take the results from the latest Max Tech video. Yes, instead of saying it's bad, what's the point then? Well, what do you refer to? Do you refer to like the overall efficiency that we just saw, where like this, where AMD gets like close to it, or like the experience that I described, where you have to tune in like which performance mode you want to activate? Because let's be honest, that has always been part of like the Windows experience, and before Apple Silicon, before when they were Intel, like well, Intel Max, obviously. The fact that we didn't have that could result in terrible battery life. So it would have almost behooved Apple at the time when they had Intel chips to actually implement that mode. But once they went with Apple Silicon, again, the advantage is not because Apple Silicon is magic. It's not because it's the best chip out there, even though often it is. It's because Apple has built Apple Silicon, which, yeah, we do associate it with like M series chips, but obviously if you think about it, Apple Silicon is everything like from A4 and up, right? And those designs were optimized for low power usage, smartphone usage, tablet usage, always on, like always standby usage, things like that, right? And yeah, the overall efficiency of the X Elite, as I say, it can be way better than the Intel chips, and well, it will be way better than the current Intel chips, and it will be genuinely a lot better than the x86 like single chips. But yeah, once we target the overall core, the overall chip, I apologize, and utilize all those cores, like, yeah, and this is where like those other competitors get closer, and this is where I believe that Strix Points, why am I saying Strix Points again and again? I always say Strix Point is, and I say Strix Points, where Strix Point will actually beat it, probably, at least in this specific result that we have seen. I still believe that X Elite will likely be more efficient on like a single core comparison. So the reason why I wanted to bring up this before I talk about the graphics test that those guys had there, which is obviously we do have Cinebench. Guys, I'm turning a video on, so you have to let me know what my audio is doing. Like, also, we do have over 20 people watching, but I believe less than 10 likes. So please correct that if you feel like it, because that obviously will be a huge help. It helps us attract new people. It helps make the live chat more lively. And yeah, let me know if the audio is well balanced.
64 version of hardware monitor. So we're gonna give you guys a lot of info. Minute stress.
Okay, so they analyzed the clock speeds. I don't think there's too much value in there, but yeah, you can see that it's like most cores are not 3.4 gigahertz. I have no idea why this was ever a marketing point by those guys, right? They said like that those max turbo numbers are like for all cores, right, at 3.4 gigahertz, but that's max. I'm like, what does that number even mean? Like, do you mean that like for desktop chips? Who cares, right? What's the meaning of that number? Yeah, I would say that this entire slide is honestly a little bit misleading, unfortunately, which a lot of this launch has been. So, yeah, going back to Max Tech.
Hold on a second. This is weird. So far, we've ran for almost 3 minutes, and we are getting chip throttling running at 2.5 gigahertz across the board, even though we're in the best performance mode. So even though it's running cool, it dropped those clock speeds. I don't know why that's happening. Maybe it's just to make sure your battery life still.
The problem is also there are other considerations in the processor beyond just like power and thermals. Now, there are obviously some of the most important things, but you also have to account for the entire design, right? Is there even enough cache to feed a task that leverages all 12 cores at max frequency? Is there enough bandwidth, right? Is the task optimized in any way to like leverage so many cores at their max speeds? Like the latter one is not as important because I believe a lot of tasks have grown very, very well optimized for multi-threaded, except for games, unfortunately, in the last few years. But yeah, anybody who likes believe that like, oh, 3.4 gigahertz across the board, that is just ludicrous because it's a 4 nanometer chip. Apple doesn't come even close to that for like on the M3 Max, right? They don't run everything at 3.4 or higher. Despite having like a higher max frequency in general, like around 4.1 gigahertz versus 3.8 for the most part. But then Qualcomm also claims like 4.3 gigahertz, which we never see. So it's a mess. And I really try to be very nice, but it's unfortunate because there's so much weirdness between like, how does it perform in this device versus how does it perform in this device? But when we actually go to like... benchmarks,
we're gonna
right?
test wildlife 0.9 FPS on the.
So when we go to 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, you'll find this is like what is it, like 6,800? Can I zoom in? Oh yeah, it's 7,000, right? So and if we compare that to the result given here, where is it? Is it actually? So yeah, these are not the full weight, but what they had isn't the full version either, right? Oh my god, it's all such a mess. Yeah, this is the Surface laptop. This has the AT100. It does not have the AT4100 variant. So this outperforms what we see from Notebook Check. But then the reason why I wanted to really talk about it, right? So this is 3D Mark. This is specifically Wildlife Extreme. But when you look at
here, we got 14.78
Steel Nomad, right? So in 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, it was about the same performance as even slightly higher than the M3, right?
That's a difference of
but
48.
Now, when you look at Steel Nomad Lite, which is the latest test from 3D Mark, it's way better optimized for like the latest versions of Vulkan, the latest versions of Metal. It's way more representative what actual like modern games will look like and work like. And now suddenly
8% and 0.78. That's a difference of 48%.
And now suddenly we have the MacBook. I just wanted to say it's 50% fast. Okay, it's 48%. You hear me, guys? And this kind of difference, a lot of people, we see similar discrepancies on the modern like smartphone market, right? Where if we look at 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, right, we see the X Elite suddenly, well, about matching, I would say. Like, well, this is almost a 10% difference, but let's say it about matches the M3 MacBook Air, right? And we do have those results almost in reverse with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 and the A17 Pro, where the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 would win this test against the A17 Pro by like 30, 40% or something crazy. But now when we look at actual games or even like more modern benchmark,
on
like
the Mac.
still Nomad
Remember, this
Lite,
is the binned
you will see those chips coming about even, showing like a similar like 30-40% difference between that old benchmark and the new benchmark, or actually like a relevant benchmark, like a real game. So this is something where I sent it out on Twitter, and Vadim simply liked it, where I did was a little provocative, where I said like, bro, we have been telling you for months, and like Evan Rogers can agree with that. He has been in part of those Twitter discussions too, where like this test is garbage just because of how old it is. Even their like first ray tracing test wasn't great, to be honest, but at least it was something newer, right? It still showed very, very weird results. But this is an old test that shows very weird results. So why do we take it? And Vadim was always defending stuff like 3D Mark or Gfxbench. And now that we have a convenient benchmark, look, like behold,
9 FPS
Vadim is now showing that, yeah, this old benchmark was completely useless, because you cannot believe that both things are simultaneously true. Like you have to understand, even if we're like with like, oh, but it underperforms on like an OpenCL 4.0 game that's like a decade old or something like that. It's like, for one, that would be absolutely irrelevant in the modern market, because those games wouldn't even be allowed on the App Store. But also, it would be very, very weird, because in those games, both chips would very likely run at such a high resolution or such a high high refresh rate that at that point it doesn't matter. What matters is how do actually modern or even semi-modern games perform, because still Nomad Lite doesn't even include like ray tracing, so it's basically just a very modern rasterization test. And I just find it funny that the second that the Max Tech guys have a very convenient test, they use it, but whenever it comes to when I try telling them, guys, right, you have access to all those chips, you have all access to all those people working for you, even if it were just you two, you would still have like way more resources than I do, especially since you do it full time. Why don't we get like proper benchmarks of games? Like, with all my criticisms for Geekervan, at least Geekervan tests like actual games. So I'm very glad that we have something like Steel Nomad Lite, and there is another benchmark coming that should be also like cross-platform and very modern. So I'm really looking forward to having more better data on the market, because it had definitely, like, 3D Mark, Wildlife, and Gfxbench have been an absolute curse on the tech industry, like for smartphones and tablets, things like that.
Remember, this is the binned. It's like opened up right here.
Okay, so for one, we will take a look at that. But yeah, if we go back here to 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme Unlimited, obviously the Pro tests, the Pro chips here, and don't get confused, the M3 Pro isn't slower than the M2 Pro. Those are different bins. This is the lower bin M3 Pro. Then the M4, it does outperform the M3, usually more by like full 10%. But as I said, 3D Mark isn't a great test. Part of that is also that the M4 has 20% more memory bandwidth than the M3, and memory bandwidth is really, really good for graphics tests. But yeah, if you look at this test, this is where their result come in below what Vadim has shown, and where in 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme, it already underperforms the M3 by quite a lot, actually. So I don't know what the discrepancy is for the testing here, because here we are at like 8,000 to 9,000 points. But yeah, you can see, by the way, how testing this shit, if you like, you have to test multiple times. Sometimes you test the device, it comes in hot or whatever. You also have to make sure that the testing scenario is at least somewhat equivalent. Like, while MacBooks, I very much appreciate that they give you full power while not plugged in, it's a little bit different. Like, if you compare it to another device that only gives you that performance while being plugged in, I still believe then you should also plug in the MacBook. So then we have have all those Geekbench, all those Gfxbench tests. As I said, those are pretty garbage, but this is still where it like handily loses to M3. Do we have really no like M2 results? Where is it? M2, 16 gigabytes. Let's run with 10 core GPU, and you'll find that it sits even with, if you compare it to like the results from Vadim, where this came to around 7,000. Now it would be at around the performance of an M2, and obviously an M2 MacBook Air, especially if you buy it like refurbished, or you can get like crazy discounts at below $1,000. Now the value proposition actually like, it's not just that in raw value, something like the VivoBook with its OLED screen might still win. But once you consider that some people might have also like a hard cap on the actual money they can spend, while now the MacBook with similar performance in several ways, like similar single core performance, similar graphics performance, actually comes in like significantly below by like 30% or something like that. He hasn't really, why is he comparing X Elite versus M3 and not M2, M3 Pro? The issue with that is its price, right? It's very, very easy to say, well, the VivoBook is $1,300, which is the same price as the 15-inch MacBook Air, right? And at that price, it comes with like 4 times more storage, an OLED 120 hertz screen, right? Now, it will be worse in several ways, like it will have worse battery life, worse trackpad, worse speakers, worse microphones, things like that, right? But a lot, like, because storage especially, and if it will have double the base memory, right? So because those things, in order to compensate just for storage and RAM, that MacBook Air would now be $600 more. This is why you would compare it. But yes, technically, if we are looking at the chip comparison, right? A comparison to base M2 and M3 makes absolutely no sense. The only thing where those chips actually come in similarly is their memory bus width, right? At 128-bit. But and that is completely Qualcomm's fault. A chip so large, in my opinion, should have, for one, more GPU cores, but it also should have a wider memory bus, so it can even fit, like that would even benefit at that point multi-threaded CPU performance as well. If you at least build the chip properly, it would also help the neural processing unit. But whatever, right? This is why they compare it, basically. It's price, it's not actual considerations of like chip size and considerations about like actual power usage, because obviously then at that point it's completely unrealistic, because the X Elite goes it up to potentially 80 watts, and now we're comparing it to a fanless MacBook Air. So, and yeah, the GPU is just a joke. Compare here, which is also why I say always watch out for different reviews and things like that, because at that point you would also be like very much in trouble with sometimes even the best reviewers get like wrong data. Sometimes the worst reviewers get right data. So get as informed as you possibly can be without obviously like giving up all your life on that. The X Elite just isn't worth it. Then we have the OpenCL Geekbench test. I always say this test isn't very relevant for games. It's very much a compute test. I don't even know, like, can you even run it at on OpenCL, or is it just automatically metal for the Apple devices? Regardless, once we actually compare like somewhat relevant devices like the Radeon 780M, which is like built into Hawkpoint, for example, well, technically in Hawkpoint we would find the 880M, but those are identical basically. So if we look at this here, now Adreno GPUs always perform somewhat badly here, but yeah, even if you account for that, that is still a big gap with like the M3. Obviously, this is like the 8-core GPU version, so the 10-core GPU version here is like monumentally faster at like 50%, which is not even funny. And then Gfxbench, I always say this is weirdly bandwidth dependent. It almost seems to scale like with bandwidth directly. This is why, for example, D8 Gen 3, which uses like 8500 megatransfers per second LPDDR5X, wins against like the A17 Pro, which has 6400 megatransfers per second LPDDR5 memory, but they also have the same bus width, right? So this is why in Gfxbench Apple typically loses. And this is how the X Elite suddenly gets closed, because as I keep saying it, this is a garbage test. And you can see that it only improves once you get to like a lot more bandwidth, because the M2 and the M3 have about the same memory bandwidth. You can account for small cache differences and call that like effective bandwidth. But yeah, fundamentally, the M2 and M3 have the same bandwidth. This is why they perform very, very similarly in this benchmark. Like an 8% difference? Yep, my head math was absolutely correct. The Radeon 780M also completely underperforms in this benchmark. This is not indicative of how it performs in actual games. This is why I hate Gfxbench. The 780M is a pretty decent integrated GPU, and yeah, usually Intel Arc will not beat it by that much. Often in actual games, it might even underperform it. So bad test. This is why I do want to use like other data, like the Vadim, the MaxTech video stuff and other things. But I understand why they test Gfxbench, because you can see it's a cheap test, right? You run it, you get results. The app doesn't cost anything, easy to install. It's available cross-platform. It doesn't take you like it's probably, I believe it has like an ARM version on Windows 2. But yeah, even here, M2 wins against the Snapdragon X Elite. Now this is the lower power version, so if you add like 20% more, now we would be talking against more like about like M3 performance. But as I said, these results are not indicative of anything in the real world. It's just like more GPU, more bandwidth, more better. The only difference here is actually where the M2 Pro here actually has more bandwidth than the M3 Pro, but that's up to Apple and how they deal with stuff like dynamic caching and other like architectural improvements of the GPU that compensate for that. So power consumption, when we actually look at games, now it's important that those games are not native here, because there's no Witcher 3 native version, unfortunately. Our GPU efficiency results are similar to the CPU results, because the Adreno GPU, which should consume around 12 to 15 watts based on our power measurements, is once again more efficient than the competition from AMD and Intel. Part of that is also just that it's very, very small, but it's clearly lagging behind the GPUs from Apple. So you can see Apple delivers like is it 1,200? No, it's 1.2 frames per second per watt. And then you can see that the M3 Pro still like scales very nicely, even though it delivers a lot more performance. It doesn't lose too much in efficiency. The M2 is pretty close to the M3. Again, part of that, probably from the node jump, you would expect a little more, but you would want probably also more bandwidth in general for like a game like Witcher 3. And then you have like different results where it's like, this is from the MacBook Pro, this is from the MacBook Air. This is where I always talk about like the discrepancies between individual tests, and that you have to rerun tests as often as possible. But yeah, nothing comes even close, because when we go to the Snapdragon X Elite, this is where we are now below 1 frames per second per watt, and significantly less so, to the point where the M3 is almost 70% more efficient than the X Elite. I actually wouldn't know if the if like the higher end version might be more efficient. This is a one difference because it depends if the extra GPU performance is achieved through higher clocks on the on the same amount of GPU cores, or through more GPU cores. So that's just one thing that if it has actually more GPU cores, it should be more efficient. But yeah, and then we have like Ryzen coming pretty close to the efficiency of that X Elite. And again, once you consider that this is actually has like real optimization from developers, because it's a similar architecture to what you will find on like the Steam Deck, all those handhelds. The Steam Deck has a slightly older architecture at this point, but that's neither here nor there. And then once you consider the fact that like Strix Points is about to come out with going from 12 cores for the GPU all the way up to 16, this is, and going all the way up to like RDNA 3.5 architecture, this is where you would definitely will see some gains. But yeah, Intel not super efficient, unfortunately, but also you have like weird discrepancies between individual results, and those are like the all external monitor tests, so I really wouldn't be able to explain any of that to you. When it comes to raw power consumption, you can see that the peak here for the Ryzen 9 7940HS, which is a 4nm APU, actually is atrocious. And then Apple using up to 4 times less energy. So again, I couldn't tell you if there's like, because if that was true, I honestly would be worried. Like, I would be wondering how we ever got somewhat decent battery life in like Windows handhelds, and then we have like this wait, is there like, what's the difference between the 7940HS and the 7840HS? 7940HS. Processor for premium laptops. General specs, that's that's Phoenix. That's 8 CPU cores, and that's a GPU with up to what should be, what was it? It should be like 12 GPU cores. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong here. Sometimes I'm not perfect either. I know I'm perfect most of the time, but not always. Default TDP, CPU compute die, package die. Wait, where is its GPU? Oh, graphics capabilities are separate. Yeah, it's 12 GPU cores. That's at 2800 megahertz. And if I go to 7840HS, is that one 7840HS? Now you can actually buy stuff, right? Because the 7840HS was like that's the 840HS, but those should be largely similar. And then when you go to yeah, it's clocked. Wait, is it clocked low? Were we at 2800 megahertz just before that? Graphics capability, yeah. So I highly doubt that even for like what is like a 3% gain in clock speeds, we would lose so much efficiency. So I wouldn't put too much trust in those results. I have no idea. Maybe it's a very, very bad driver on the framework laptop. Those are the super repairable guys that like Linus from Linus Tech Tips has like a financial investment in. But I would believe that these results are far, far more representative of the real world. And then of course Apple like uses less power still. Yeah, and then we don't actually get too much more. We do have like a comparison for 4K YouTube playback. We also check the power consumptions of the laptops while idling and during playback of a 4K YouTube video. We once again used an external 4K display to avoid impact. So this is not a difference between like their OLED screen or Apple's LCD screen. So Apple, once again, nobody comes close to their idle power consumption, though thankfully this is a leap ahead of the current x86 chips we have on the market. And when we look at something like playing back a 4K YouTube video, it's hilarious where it's like it gets close to the idle power consumption metrics here, which while on something like the Ryzen chips, it like doubles power consumption. Now on Intel, it's actually like, this is also one of those results where I would tell you to take it with a pinch of salt, for the simple reason that it depends somewhat on if the main CPU tile had to be activated, because Meteor Lake has like that, has its SoC tile, which is based on TSMC 6 nanometer, and has 2 low power efficiency cores there. And apparently, if the drivers are all right, you can get only that SoC tile to turn on, not the main CPU tile or the GPU tile. Because if you turn on those tiles, yeah, then you get quite a lot of power consumption. But apparently, you should still be probably more like... oh my God, what would they even like? It would be at least competitive, which this sort of looks competitive, but on a ludicrous scale, obviously away from what Apple does. And here it's basically like, this would be a joke, right? And I assume it would be more like 12, 13 watts or whatever, because I have seen once, if you get like a very, very well optimized like Meteor Lake laptop, I have seen them outperform the Ryzen devices in battery life, but it's very hit and miss if you can actually achieve that. And when it comes to idle power consumption, I couldn't tell you. This probably also is like extremely dependent on the actual device, because now you also have like all the like BIOS and firmware stuff from the actual manufacturer built in, and then of course Windows in of itself is probably less efficient. It's a bit of a mess. I would actually love to see all of those chips except for Apple running Linux and see how that impacts any of those things, or like at least like manually controlling for it to not do anything else during like YouTube playback. So their main like conclusion here is basically that Apple remains kind of undefeated when it comes to efficiency. That being said, of course, that doesn't mean that Apple is fully perfect here. I do believe that, for example, we are a little bit overdue of more GPU performance from Apple, but that's kind of more the result of Apple like withholding more cores for the Pros and the Max chips, because then they can charge for them. Making the base M chip larger will just make it more expensive and potentially eat away from sales for a Pro and Max chip. So I fully understand why they don't want to do that. Agree, Meteor Lake battery performance vary versus laptop OEM, maybe different firmware. Yeah, I've seen like super different results. And a lot of the bad stuff about Meteor Lake was especially at launch, right? Which is obviously when we get most data from, but even in general, we saw a lot of updates for like the firmware in like the first 4 to 6 weeks across the board for basically every manufacturer. And then of course, with all of those devices, you also have to consider, is there like a dedicated GPU inside? Because that will sometimes be very firmware dependent on how efficient a chip can actually get or not. So yeah, I don't like, not a chip, an actual device. So there's a lot of like hit and miss data here, and I'm glad they are at least mentioning like the actual devices where they tested this on, because it would be quite messy to just say, well, this is the result for the 7840HS and this is the result for Strix points or Strix points. I said it again, for X Elite or whatever. But yeah, Kevin O'Reilly, who watched us yesterday, welcome, my brother, to the stream. We are now almost at 1.5 hours. I do want to remind you guys again to like the video if you're enjoying it. That helps us tremendously. Please be active in the chat, because that is obviously also a big help, both to me and also how the video performs in general. Beyond that, share the video so more people can find us. And if you want to support us directly, leave a small donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker. All help is greatly appreciated and gets put right back into the channel. And of course, if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can subscribe to my Patreon. Link is in the description of this channel. So yeah, I actually like, and this is, by the way, like with Witcher, like again, and I said that before, these results are not optimized apps. So I wonder if Apple is really like easily over doubling the efficiency of those other chips in terms of their GPU, and that obviously would go far above the efficiency gains that we would associate from going like from 4 nanometer to N3B. Kevin asking, how's the stream? Have you missed anything? Well, you have missed us going through a lot of benchmark data and us going through parts of the latest video from MaxTech, but you can watch it afterwards. I'll forgive you. I don't know why my microphone is so in the way for me with like its boom arm. Maybe I'm just psychologically not tailored today for like having anything in my face that way. So what else did Vadim test from MaxTech? I'm actually interested to see what their like thermal performance test looks like. As always, I do want to remind you guys that testing the external temperature of a device is not a very relevant temperature thing, but you can sometimes get some data out of it if you combine that with also like data about the actual temperature on the chip, and of course if there's like any thermal throttling going on.
This is the M3 MacBook Air. We're seeing 43 degrees Celsius at the hottest point with that huge hot spot. And on this one, oh my goodness, 47 degrees Celsius. But you guys see the heat is being spread out over here. That's probably where the fan is. I thought this thing had dual fans.
Guys, let me know. Can you hear me well? Because so I have tried what Kevin O'Reilly suggested. The problem is now I'm partially covering up my iPad where all my chats are, but I am far less psychologically
Look at this, guys,
worried by
2.2.
this.
It actually dropped all the clock. So it could just be because you already can't feed it enough power to get the right clock speeds. They're running at lower clock speeds. And
once again, we haven't done any note-taking this video just yesterday.
That is just odd. Looking at the Mac here, we're only running at 9 watts on the CPU. I believe this is running at 23 watts for the Max. Could be slightly lower now, but it does use a lot more power. And I think because they limited it to that 23 watts, no higher, that's why this could be happening. This chip technically can go up to 80 if you have crazy cooling, but they probably put in that hard cap to give you that great battery life. All right, guys, we have our scores, and this is impressive. We have 550 points on the M3 Air. Of course, it does thermal throttle, but the X Elite Surface got 841. That is a difference of 53%. So even though the clock
for 2.5 times more wattage, so the efficiency is quite honestly terrible. But then again, also, why compare it with the M3? Like, you will get potentially lower wattage from the M3 Pro.
Speeds ran low. The performance is dropped. Those
Cinebench. I don't really care. Oh yeah, okay. Let's do some small stuff, right? SSD speed test. I know it's about the same. Let's look at speedometer.
Which is killer. And now I have speedometer 3.0 running. This tests the overall web application performance and the general web speed. And look at this, guys. We have 30.5 compared to 29. That is a 5% performance.
That's speedometer 3.0? Really? Such a small difference? That would...
Difference. This is the closest that a Windows laptop has ever gotten to a Mac with the same generation machines. And just using that
might be thus far the most impressive result that I've seen.
Just using it as a laptop, this is the fastest, quickest experience I've ever had in Windows. Extremely snappy, so quick, and it just makes me happy how responsive and nice it is to use it.
I know that some people have said that like Max and Vadim. By the way, this is Max. This is not Vadim. The reason why I often bring up Vadim when it comes to MaxTech is because that's who I interact with on Twitter primarily. Of course, I know the difference between the two brothers, but yeah, this is actually the most impressive result I've seen thus far for the X Elite.
Is super impressive.
up
M3 is
pretty
about
well with
15%
what I would expect.
faster, and I guess that kind of lines up with our single core performance.
I don't even know. Does this use GPU? I'm so like this is the weird part about this Figma web design that that they have been using, which is it's not useless overall. It's just that I don't know. They say like they know the guys who like make this, but like couldn't you have like really asked them like what does this test use? Can it be like GPU accelerated? Is it like well multi-threaded or only single-threaded? Like it leaves us to make a lot of assumptions in order to analyze it. And you know what happens when you make assumptions? You make an ass out of yourself.
Figma opened up on so 7 degrees Celsius. Can go up to 8.
Yeah, so in thermal performance, we saw that it definitely doesn't run all its cores at 3.4 gigahertz.
A 3D Mark Wildlife that a lot of people run. And here we could see because
we saw the discrepancy between like the different 3D Mark tests. I'm glad. Well, will they test like no? They don't test Gfxbench here, which I'm very grateful for. So let's see how it performs in Lightroom Classic. And so I have to say, thus far, I'm most impressed by the result from speedometer, because speedometer is notoriously better on Macs or iOS than like competing Android and Windows devices, so that's actually quite positive.
Let's do a test for creatives. I have Lightroom Classic opened up right here, and I also with this test want to see how emulation works, because a lot of these applications like Lightroom Classic, they are not designed yet for Windows ARM. Adobe's working on it, and other companies are as well. But you can still run it, right?
So I've seen some criticism here where he definitely like leaves out a lot of what they would have tested otherwise, right? They do have the Lightroom comparison, but I don't see like a Premiere comparison, obviously because Premiere Pro has promised like an update in a month. And then we don't see any coding comparisons. Obviously, you would have to sometimes use different apps, but that's just the nature of using different operating systems sometimes. So I'm definitely not quite happy with the chosen benchmarks in general.
Trying it. Sometimes the Mac is slightly faster. I was thinking with emulation, we're gonna have some slowdowns. That is actually quite nice. Previously with the SQ3, it would be super slow. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. Nice and quick. A little bit behind the Mac, but really close.
We also saw that like Lightroom seems to be very easy to like emulate or translate. We saw that with like Apple Silicon when it initially came out. It actually was very, very fluid even before it got like a native ARM version.
Now I'm gonna edit all 50 of these high resolution edited images, but first I went into our preferences here, and with the M3, we can use the GPU for full graphics acceleration, but with the X Elite, it is disabled because of an error. It's just not designed to use it.
That will be brutal.
And so we saw on some Intel laptops, it would only get half acceleration. Here, it's not gonna use that at all. I'll also mention that because we only have 8 gigs of RAM on here compared to 16, the 8 gig model is a lot slower than the 16 gig M3 because of Apple's dumb choice just to not give it enough RAM. It's a major bottleneck. So this is gonna be—
No, it's a dumb decision until you consider that Apple makes like $190 in profit from making you upgrade for $200 from 8 gigs of RAM to 16. The people who still buy the 8 gig version, believe me, they're barely touched by this because they don't care. If they use Lightroom, they definitely don't use it to simultaneously export 50 megapixel images.
Be interesting. All right, let's hit export here. I'm starting my timer, and out of the get-go, the X Elite might be going quicker here. I know the bar is larger, so let's see what happens. All right, guys, I am impressed.
Yeah, then I'm sorry, then it's a very, very badly optimized GPU acceleration. Again, also like completely different power consumption numbers. I wouldn't be surprised if like the Mac ran at like 6 to 8 watts on the GPU and maybe at most 10 watts once you combine like maybe one core running to control it. Yeah, and while this was running, it's still a like your full 23 watts on all cores as much as possible.
Wow, okay. So the M3 with 8 gigs took a minute and 53.95, basically a minute
That's a
54.
very weird
The
benchmark.
Surface with X Elite took a minute and 39. So even without graphics acceleration, just because the CPU is fast, we have 16 gigs of RAM, it beat out.
Wait, what? What did they do to GIMP the Mac? The Mac just won before
I'll
that.
also mention, go ahead and zoom in here.
What? Guys, what am I missing here?
Preparation, super slow, quite nice. Previously with the SQ4 snap, so nice and quick, all 50 with the M3 resolution edited images. But first, I went into our preferences here, all super slow. Let's go ahead and zoom in here.
Did I?
Now let's do a test for creation.
Guys, let me know what I'm missing
what the performance is like. We know the storage is really fast. Thankfully, I was thinking with emulation, we're gonna have some. It would be super slow. Let's go ahead and zoom in here.
Okay.
Nice and quick.
So where did he run?
A little bit behind the Mac.
Did I imagine
really
the export?
And now I'm gonna edit all 50 of these high resolution edited images. But first, I went into our preferences here, and with the M3, it is. And so we saw on some Intel laptops, it would only get half acceleration. Here, it's not gonna use that out. Just to not give it enough RAM. It's my timer. So this is gonna be
that was. I'm sorry. In my head, I used like the export numbers for that Figma benchmark, right? That is not correct.
Let's hit.
Okay, so this is just bullshit at that point, because now you're comparing like an M3, like you're not comparing to like even the base M3 Pro that has still like, by the way, the base M3 Pro has 5 performance and 6 efficiency cores. It has fewer cores overall than the X Elite, which are all performance cores. It can call 4 of those cores an efficiency cluster, but that's silly.
Export here. I'm starting my timer.
Okay,
rest. Wow. 95. So it beat out the M3 with 8 gigs. Now the M3 with 16 gigs is a minute and 3 seconds, so that does still win out.
Wait, a minute and what?
Now the M3 with 16 gigs is a minute and 3 seconds, so that.
Okay, so now they're doing just garbage. They're trying to like price match them in weird ways. What is the pricing of the Surface family right now? Because they are not that far apart that it would warrant you like gimping them. So Surface laptop, which gen is this even? Like 9 at this point? 7? I always like Surface laptop. Yeah, it's 7th generation. But I do want it on the English website, so I can make a proper like US American comparison and in the proper US dollars. So I don't have to give you like weird European prices, because I know you guys don't like that. Wait, where's like, why is it always so difficult to, do I have to write it like English US? Does that work? Please tell me it works. Yeah, it worked. I'm so smart. I'm so smart. So if we go to the Surface laptop, 13 inches. Oh yeah, that's because it starts with the X Plus. So let's go with the X Elite. That's $1,400 for 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of SSD storage, right? If we go to apple.com, which again, I hope it opens up the actual .com website. Let's forget the current student rebates. They're cool. And let's go with the MacBook Air, right? I know that then there will be like screen differences, but if we are talking raw power, right? If we want to give you a device with 512 gigs of storage and 12 gigs and 16 gigs of memory, at which point it becomes a lot faster, right? Now we're looking at $14.99 versus $16.99. And then for 1 terabyte, you actually have to pay $200, which is the same upgrade pricing here. And for 16 gigs of RAM, you have to pay the same $400 here, which is quite egregious actually considering. And yeah, only the black 64 gigabyte 1 terabyte SSD, I would say paying $400 for going from 32 to 64 is obviously way more acceptable than paying $400 to go from 16 to 32. So it's a weird test. Okay, so now I understand why some people were picking on the MaxTech guys for this, because you only choose like this benchmark, and that's slightly problematic, I'll admit. And also, if you fully commit to like that Macs are a little more expensive, right, because they also have other quality of life features, of course, if you then go to like the MacBook Pro, right, now you do get 120 hertz, right, but you also get mini LED, right? So now it's a higher quality panel than what is on the Surface laptop, which I know some people have tried to say it's OLED. It's not. OLED is for the Surface Pro. And yeah, while you do pay a lot for storage and RAM, once you are in the higher price category, let's just even look at this model. Let's look at the M3 Pro here. $2,000, 512 gigabytes storage, 18 gigs of RAM, significantly now more performance than the X Elite. While yes, it is obviously expensive here to then go up to the fully unbinned version and 1 terabyte of storage for $2,400. Well, again, you can also get like a completely worthless 64 gigs of RAM to never utilize it properly on this device, because why would you need 64 gigabytes here? So, and get a device with better speakers, better camera, a better screen, better microphones, even better trackpad, and all the advantages of Apple Silicon. Of course, I believe this one also doesn't come with a lot of ports, right? This has one USB-A, two USB-C, and the Microsoft Surface connector. Obviously, if you compare that to the M3 Pro, now you're getting the full-size SD card slot, a high-quality headphone jack, an HDMI 2.1 port. You get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports. So yeah, the value comparison here can be a little wacky, of course. Of course, if you do want a lot of memory and things like that, now we're talking about, do you want the Max chip? But then the M3 Max is completely incomparable to what Microsoft is offering here with the X Elite. And of course, even here, you have to consider that we are choosing the X Elite, right? Not even like the full 84-100 version, right? That has the entire GPU. So now you're looking at M2 level performance in certain ways. And while yes, it will beat an M2 in like single core performance and whatever, now you also have to be asked, like I've seen people like online say like, look, I upgraded from an M2 Pro MacBook Pro or whatever to a Snapdragon X Elite. Look, it beats in like multi-threaded performance and in single-threaded or whatever, right, in Geekbench. But then it takes like one look and you will see that like, oh, but the actual like efficiency here, where's like M2 Pro here? Cinebench. No, not this one. Not this one. That single core efficiency here. M2 Pro, still way more efficient. So there's no upgrade here too, right? In terms of like single core performance, actually in Cinebench, this one is not better than the M2 Pro. Now in Geekbench, yes, it will be faster than like the M2 Pro, but barely really. Right, how much faster is this? 7% faster. But then you look at graphics performance, right? Even in like what I call not so great benchmarks, and you look at the potential of the M2 Pro versus the X Elite, especially this like lower power version, now you're like doubling performance. So people who are like saying, oh, thank you Microsoft for sending me a Surface laptop, now I can finally upgrade my M2 Max or whatever, or even like my base M3 Mac, and I'm like, bro, have you actually looked at what you are upgrading to? Like I understand sometimes they will say like, oh, and now I get finally like an OLED screen on like the VivoBook, but the VivoBook, as we have seen, is not an upgrade in performance in pretty much any way. And it then has like a ton of quality of life features that are diminished. Like it has a weird micro SD card slot that is super slow, and its speakers are bad and things like that. So I'm like, what exactly are you upgrading to? And in fact, there's one last YouTube video here that I do want to like slightly look into, and that is from the guys that we just like read obviously a lot, the Notebook Check guys, and they have like analyzed the Snapdragon X Elite, but they did it based on the VivoBook, and in this case it would be like the lowest end version. So I will be increasing the speed here a little bit, and I will be skipping certain parts so I don't make this like a 2.5 hour video again. This will probably end up being like a 2 hour and 10-minute video. And before I start this, I want to tell you guys again, please, if you're enjoying this, subscribe, like, share the video, comment right away. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with, and you feel like supporting the channel directly. Leave a super chat, leave a super sticker, or consider subscribing to my Patreon. All support is greatly appreciated. Justin saying, this is a great review. Yeah, I actually think this was very level-headed, and the reason why I waited for it was because I did want the corresponding written data, and I just couldn't find it yesterday. So they either uploaded it later or I was just a moron. So yeah, this is a good video. This is way better than everything else that we have reacted to thus far. And I still am open to reacting to more and more, obviously, especially as we also keep like getting different variants of the X Elite and all kinds of products. But for now, it's the Surface. We saw that now with Max Tech. It's the Galaxy Book. We saw that yesterday with Matt Talks Tech. And the VivoBook, which we saw partially in like Dave 2D's video, but only partially. We didn't cover all of Dave 2D's video. And while we're watching this, as always, please let me know if the audio and video quality is working all right for you, if the stream is stable, all that classic stuff.
Fellow notebook aficionados, I'm sure your timeline is absolutely swamped with reviews and videos about this guy right here in front of me. This is
actually
the VivoBook
not so
50,
much.
and it seems like,
at least not in the first couple of hours. It seems like a lot of people delayed like their reviews, some by as much as a day or two, because they were like dealing with some firmware stuff and they were like very unsure about certain results. And then there's the entire question about like Copilot Plus, which is like getting an update today, but I haven't seen yet videos about that. So if I will cover it, I'll probably be covering it either tomorrow or sometime during the weekend if that data actually comes out. Like, what does Copilot do? How well does it do it? And how much does it impact things like battery life and RAM usage? I'm very interested in all of it.
ASUS generously shipped them all around the world to give you a first real-world look at what Qualcomm's new Snapdragon Silicon can do for Windows on ARM. It has been about 9 months since these chips were officially announced, and since then, we have been promised nothing short of the next big revolution in our PC experience. And, well, I do not want to spoil this review too much, but our experience with this one was almost flawless. If you were to peel the sticker from the chassis, you would have absolutely no way of knowing that there is not an x86 CPU by either Intel or AMD powering.
Yeah, this is why I was a little skeptical first about this statement, but this statement has to be seen in the context. They were very much using it as like a daily driver device. They weren't like testing dozens of games for it or anything. So when he says it's flawless, he means like, oh, it doesn't like crash all the time. Most apps that they try run, the compatibility translation layer actually works, things like that. That's what he means by that.
VivoBook, but at the same time, the overall user experience is also pretty much the same. Do not get me wrong, this is the first notebook we have in the studio powered by the Snapdragon X Elite. And we will see how things develop over the next few months when both hardware and software catch up. But as far as first impressions go, is it really enough for Windows on ARM to be the same Windows PC experience we already know? Well, let's get into it. Alright, let's start at the beginning. The VivoBook S15
I did
is powered by the
speed up,
smallest
right?
available
Yeah, I
variant
did.
of Snapdragon X Elite CPUs, the X1
Okay,
P78100. It rolls right
Overview,
off the
specs,
selection
chest.
is-
Okay, we don't need to analyze the device too much. I think the one thing
Oh,
that
with
I
Qualcomm
saw
picture,
here
even though it's not a
is
huge
like
department.
the camera looks terrible. Now I know he's testing in a relatively low light room, but yeah, and the microphone is okay. From what I've seen.
front board touchpad, and typing the script for this video on the VivoBook was a very pleasant experience. The switches offer quite
I
a bit
don't
of travel,
like
solid
the
tactility, and a
asymmetrical
comfortable
design
feel,
with
and most
the
of you should get up to speed here
touchpad
rather
because
quickly.
it has it's number.
If you like the layout, however, will depend
it
on your
has,
personal
like, what is
preference.
it called? The
Especially
number
the
pad,
slip-down keys for the
numpad.
number block do take quite some time to get
I
used
don't like that it has USB-A ports, but you apparently cannot make a Windows device these days without USB-A ports. Like, it's so weird. I've heard even some it wasn't some kind of like a video from Short Circuit from the LTT guys, and one of the ports on a laptop was like a USB 2 port, and he was like, I actually appreciate it being USB 2 because some accessories just don't play nice with USB 3. I'm like, then those accessories, right? Why do I have to bother about, why do I have to have a basically useless port in my device? What the F are you talking about? And I already dislike USB-A, but like, for example, on my MacBook, I never use the SD card slot. I never use the HDMI. I constantly use all my 3 Thunderbolt ports, actually. I have like USB-C earpods. Now, granted, I could do the 3.5 millimeter ones just for my MacBook, but then they wouldn't work with my iPhone and my iPad. So I do like them the most, but I do still have 3.5 pairs out there, which would also connect directly to the microphone. So let's even say I always use 2 Thunderbolt ports, right? But that's also because I always have MagSafe charging. So in a device that doesn't have a dedicated charging plug, that's already problematic. And then I have one cable going out to my microphone system, and one is always connected to my iPhone, charging it and basically getting data back and forth for continuity camera. It's just like USB-A doesn't help me with any of that. Now I would have to carry adapters around with me because all my cables are C2C, or I would have to carry new USB-A 2C cables with me, which are like often speed limited and stuff like that. It's such a shame that people still insist on that.
The touch 120 Hz OLED with its
Yeah, the display is good. It's a 120 Hz OLED. It's up to 500 nits. I've seen some tests where it doesn't reach it, which would be a shame because MacBooks are now 600 nits in SD brightness. Obviously, it doesn't come close to the like 1600 nits peak HDR brightness, but it does give you like pixel by pixel, basically perfect black. So that's the advantage of OLED. So I probably would prefer mini LED in its current form versus OLED. But if you ask me like a mini LED, like even like on my device that theoretically only goes up to 500 nits, then I would kind of have to think about it. And I should also let you know, I am on the record to saying, while I do appreciate the perfect blacks of OLED, I do like me the general color science of LCD panels or like LED panels more than OLED. Even the most color accurate OLEDs, even like on iPhone, whatever, I have never liked them as much as like I like the mini LED screens on like my iPad Pro and my MacBook Pro.
The quirky resolution, all of that on the website, but especially when it comes to laptops. The user experience is so much more than just benchmark result. And as I have mentioned already, in the beginning, you are not losing out on anything when going with a Snapdragon-powered notebook. But at the same time, you're also not getting anything that is vastly superior to what an Intel or AMD-powered laptop can do. There is still a fan inside this phone, and while the subjective performance experience is incredibly snappy and you do not really have to deal with finding out if software runs natively or is emulated, on paper the X Elite is not that much faster.
You do. Over time, you see the difference sometimes in battery life, sometimes in RAM usage. Now, I always had a relatively high-end Apple Silicon device with 32 gigs of RAM and enough cores to throw at most problems. And of course, the M1 Max is connected to DC decent cooling with like 2 fans and stuff like that, and the 72 watt-hour battery. But if you are on like a base M1 chip and with like 8 gigs of RAM, 256 gigs of storage, and like 50 watt-hour battery, then you do sometimes have to think about like, well, this app is like non-native, might have some battery life issues, might eat up a little bit too much memory or something like that. For example, to me, it was like the difference between like Streamlabs, right, and OBS, where Streamlabs, which is in many ways just OBS but prettier, was like for a long time not native on ARM. On Apple Silicon Macs, basically. So I ended up doing all my streams through OBS, even though I did prefer Streamlabs a little bit. And now it's been so much time. The last time I opened up Streamlabs, I was like, oh, okay, I'm not even familiar with this anymore. Guess now I'm an OBS kind of guy.
Than recent silicon from Team Red or Blue. At its core, the X Elite X1E 78-100 is a 12-core CPU, and since it's the lowest and varying around 45 to 50 watts.
Okay, so yeah, we have seen like obviously some results here too. It's interesting because they do bring up the power profiles here and how much performance they use. It seems like on the VivoBook, the highest and like the turbo is at around 50 watts. So this is more comparable to a Max M series chip than even an M Pro, but no base M chip ever goes beyond basically this. And even then it will still be probably more below 15. So yeah, and then like the results, we've compared those already. We saw that like Macs still win, but they do deliver some decent results. We talked about the 3D Mark Wildlife results, where for their testing, Macs deliver you like 8,000 something points. For the Max Tech review, they somehow were like very evenly matched, so I couldn't tell you. And then the fan noise, obviously, it's not great. The fact that even at 20 watts, we still have to activate the fan and stuff like that. Because like on my Mac, it very often, even in some demanding tasks, the fans just don't wrap up or don't wrap up much at all. Which like, yeah, 32 decibels, you probably won't hear much anyway, because that's basically like around the noise of a quiet room, if that makes sense. Because technically we don't live in a vacuum, so nothing is ever 100% quiet. But yeah, like 40 decibels, a jump of 10 decibels is roughly doubling your perceived loudness of this thing. So this like 45 watt mode is absolutely terrible already, and then at 57 decibels, that's horrendous.
Watts during peak load scenarios and around 30 to 35 watts under sustained load. For our benchmarks, we tried to stay as close as possible to our usual set of tests to properly put the new silicon into perspective.
Yeah, and this is why I've tried to say that even like their Witcher 3 efficiency tests, which they've also applied to like the Mac, are a little weird, because obviously now you're running those apps through a compatibility and emulation, a translation layer. So yeah, I can see also some valid criticism towards them. However, given that they are trying to deliver day one coverage, that is somewhat forgivable, right? Because they cannot wait like weeks and months until they have enough like optimized apps and games to actually test out. They do have to give you like real results from like real apps and games that people actually really use.
With what is currently available. So you just have to remember that some benchmarks are emulated, which might severely impact our measured performance figures. This becomes immediately noticeable when comparing Cinebench R23 to R24.
Yeah.
While the
as
older
I
version
said,
does not paint a
Cinebench,
very
as I said
favorable
that now
picture
20
of the new
times,
chip, when it comes to
R23
single
is
and
garbage.
multiple nodes, the natively
for
running R24 shows that the
for
Snapdragon
ARM,
can indeed compete without a problem. Just keep in mind that when it comes to laptops,
which is still
the performance
funny
you are
because
getting
the
is
Mac
heavily
still
influenced by the
wins,
power levels
but
set by the manufacturers. So your results will vary greatly
and it's
between
not called
different notebooks.
R23
But even the
or
slowest
it's
variant of the
just
X
called
Elite can keep up with Intel's Meteor
2024,
Lake Core
which
Ultra
is
7
weird
in the
branding
test,
by
which
the
is
Cinema
quite
4D
impressive,
guys.
especially
And yeah,
on launch day.
this is I just like that we've obviously looked at that graph, but I think it's very, very imposing here. Again, just seeing where the M3 is and then considering where the M4 would sit.
In single-core scenarios, it only has to yield to Apple's M3 generation of ARM chips. Geekbench paints a similar picture and shows impressive performance results without revolutionizing what we have seen so far from a mobile CPU. Again, if you want to dive deeper into our results and for more benchmark numbers from a whole host of tests, please head on over to our written review. And for the nitty-gritty details when it comes to power consumption and efficiency, check out our analysis article as well. Our subjective performance impression is impressive, even though our numbers from Crossmark do paint a very different picture.
Yeah, Crossmark is a weird test. It's mainly a CPU test. It's somewhat single core dependent, but again, like I believe here it's running through a translation layer. I wouldn't even call it like super representative of everything that like your regular system does, even though Macs win. Again, this is why a lot of people will say like, well, a Geekbench sucks because it's Apple Bench and Apple always wins. And I'm like, okay, so Crossmark is now Apple Bench. It's now Apple Mark or Cross Apple, right? Cinebench is now Apple Bench because Apple wins. Like, can Apple ever win without getting accused of cheating is basically my question. But yeah, in this test, this is translated. I assume this is native. And yeah, this definitely, from everything that I've heard, from the general snappiness of devices to the fact that like it actually delivers pretty good results in something like Speedometer 3.0, I wouldn't obviously take this as like representative of its real world performance. So for all my criticism of the X Elite, it's not that bad by any means. Oh, Suboito, also long friend of the channel and my Twitter account. The question, all of this tool, are they adapted for Snapdragon? Saying hello to your German boy. I thought I was your Apple sheep because of my long hair. Now that it's short, now I'm just a German boy.
Microsoft emulation layer having to do some heavy lifting behind the scenes. Our browser benchmarks, on the other hand, can dominate both Intel and AMD, and once again, the X Elite only has to play second fiddle to Apple's
And
M3.
another browser
Alright,
benchmark where Apple wins. Yay!
So how about the GPU?
And I apologize. Another browser benchmark where Apple cheats.
Generally speaking,
I guess.
especially when it comes to games, you will most likely come across the most problems with what will run on your new machine and what doesn't. And we really would have wished either Qualcomm or Microsoft would give users some form of indication what runs natively and what needs emulation. In our synthetic tests, though,
this is why I wanted to bring up their review, because they do bring up 3D Mark here.
Is not quite able to keep up with the competition.
It's unfortunate because, and as I've said also in my last video, graphics emulation, if it works, it's very likely to actually work decently well, because a lot of compatibility stuff would more likely be a CPU issue. Unless we are also talking about old games like DirectX 9 stuff, because now you have to like also deal with the fact that the X Elite doesn't actually natively support DirectX 9. It only supports natively DirectX 11 and 12.
Like 3D Mark's Time Spy or Firestrike, or natively running benchmarks like 3D Mark's Wildlife Unlimited.
And Suboito, I'll just appreciate you calling me by my name and sending me a super chat for all those insults over the years.
But as we have seen with
so 3D Mark, where are the actual games?
To level the playing field with driver support, and only time will tell if
they
are able
they
to
didn't tell. Okay, so they would have included
so
them, but they didn't.
In something like the MacBook Air 15.
Okay, there was like one. Somebody tested out games on them, but like who was it? X Elite. No, it wasn't the tech chap. It wasn't the Max Tech guys either. Now my mouse disappeared. There was like one. It wasn't Mac Talks Tech. I'm not paying you, Suboito, for anything. Not after the Apple sheep comments, my dude. Book for Edge. Tech Sport. Did Tech tablets have like any gaming benchmarks? Teardown, 120, Snapdragon Time Spy, Wildlife, and Cinebench. Yeah, nobody does like proper gaming benchmarks, I guess. This is also where we unfortunately hit like questions of like, can we please get like reviews from the likes of Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus? So battery life, we actually saw here, there were, yeah, it wins here, but somehow not against the Intel Ultra 9. So there are some discrepancies here. Now this is the VivoBook S14 versus the VivoBook S15, and it's also hard to like match all settings between like these devices. But yeah, Matthew Monitz does like good reviews too. But I believe he also mentioned stuff like, oh yeah, well, like World of Warcraft, which is like native.
Like I said, the majority of games are built for ARM. And I tried lots of games. Like Fortnite, forget it. It's not even going to load. It just says, can't use it, not meant for
Okay,
ARM.
so we do have one piece of data. Yeah, I did check out the MaxTech video. You can go back to like once the stream is finished, which it will be like in 5 to 10 minutes. So, and then you can watch the MaxTech portion of it. But we didn't watch the entire video because quite honestly, it was more a comparison between the Surface laptop and the MacBook Air and or the Pro. I don't even care at this point. And I just didn't care that much for it because I know the differences. Yeah, so and we already like reacted indirectly to like a hardware comparison yesterday with Mad Talks Tech, and that didn't end up too well. So I wasn't too interested in wasting time today because we have now been streaming for 2 hours.
Diablo 4, which is a very well optimized game, not very demanding. It will work and it runs for about a minute, but then
okay, so we have complete incompatibility with games like Fortnite, which is probably one of the most popular games in the world. Diablo 4, very popular cross-platform game, basically not supported
Overwatch,
by
also
crashing.
Low
Overwatch is the game where we saw Dave2D bring up that it runs at like 82 FPS at 1080p low.
Works, but the maximum.
Oh, Mokotic, hello, welcome to the stream. Games that use anti-cheat protection will soon work on ARM laptops. Yes, the question is there are other issues though, like some of these games do not just show issues with like believing, oh, is this like a cheater device? And then, by the way, this is why I'm refraining from doing deep dives into GPU tests. I'm just bringing up what is already out there, right? I'm not complaining why there's like no in-depth testing on all games. I understand that some games right now will have problems with anti-cheat software and whatever. But for example, why couldn't you run those this on like God of War 2018, right? Which is on Steam, which is not too difficult to run given that it's mostly a PS4 game and it's and you can optimize the settings there quite well. And it's a DirectX 11 game, so which is natively supported but also not super taxing, which to me is like I want to see that.
Resolution is 1280 by 1080, which is not the best. You can only run it in windowed mode.
Yeah, so you can already see this is not anti-cheat things, even though I would assume that something like Overwatch struggles with that. But like, yeah, it doesn't actually give you like native 1080p. It does like 1280 by 1080, which technically would be like a 4:3 aspect ratio. But like, I assume this is then like stretched almost. Or it like applies like weird checkerboard rendering almost. So, and also we have heard that some games might not actually run at the resolution that you specify, but instead they run at a low resolution and then upscale it with like the new software that Microsoft has put in there. So it's weird that the chip seems to be like very opinionated and sometimes doing shit that you don't want it to do.
You can only have the graphics at like medium. It doesn't look that great. And then when you actually play the game, there's a lot of drop frames because it feel like it's translating on the fly. And that's the thing. No matter what game you play on this, if it's
I've also heard that it like stutters in a lot of games where it doesn't just have like a low average frame rate, but where it will actually have like frame rate inconsistencies and be like jittery to the view.
Optimized for x86, you're going to take a performance hit. Like even Dirt 5, which is supposed to be better on an ARM chip, 19 frames per second, 24 if you're lucky. Now, if you're playing an ARM game like World of Warcraft, It's good. Like I was running World of Warcraft. I know it's an older game, but with high settings,
Yeah,
2880
and
or
this is,
2800 by
for
60.
example, this is a good test where I would love somebody to run it against like whatever the latest version of Warcraft runs on Macs, because it does have an ARM version on Mac as well. It's decently optimized for Metal. It gives you up to 120 frames per second, things like that. So yeah, this is probably the most relevant game to test, and the fact that it doesn't have like any anti-cheat thing like preventing it, probably because it's already now native for ARM. Like, yeah, that's perfect.
1920, which is full 3K resolution. It ran good. Like I was getting 40 to 60 frames per second. If you drop it down to 1080, you're going all the way up to 70 frames per second. Now the laptop itself is actually really nice. Like ASUS built a beautiful product. There's only ways.
Okay, so I just wanted to bring up those benchmarks because for some reason nobody wants to test like productivity app. So like Dave 2D mentioned that it's like way faster than like the last AMD ARM laptop chip when it comes to Premiere Pro, but the Premiere also still isn't native on ARM, so it is now drastically slower. I've seen people say that it crashes, that it can barely handle like 4K video editing, something that even the M1 would have been capable of doing even on like 8 gigabytes. But again, we don't know how much of that has to do with the compatibility layer, how much of that might be an old media encoder and decoder. Some people have speculated that like the GPU inside the Snapdragon X Elite is actually an older generation GPU than what we have on like comparable Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 devices. So maybe the media encoders are also worse. It's really hard to tell. I just wanted to give you all the data that is already out there. I do hope you guys feel like I comment on it fairly, like I don't jump to conclusions. I don't just call it trash because it's not Apple or because it has some compatibility issues. I am absolutely fine with it is having some early teething issues. It's just that I feel like the coverage originally for Apple Silicon was a lot more in depth, which surprises me almost because, yeah, while I do understand that Apple usually gets a lot more coverage than other companies, this has been like 9 months in the making. We had like 4 or 5 keynotes from Qualcomm talking about this processor. So I would assume that at this point, kind of everyone would be curious and really, really like itching to test very specific things. But alas, we do not have that. And again, this is the Vivo book, so its graphics results will also be like the worst, right? It's the lowest end X Elite chip, which doesn't just impact its GPU performance, but its CPU performance when it comes to translating stuff. Because it has lower CPU performance, it's very likely to also negatively impact the translation layer. Yazin Willi saying at the current price performance with the Windows on ARM compatibility issues, it's almost dead on arrival. I agree. And the last thing I would bring up here before we go to like offline, I don't know, is it Windows Central? There's like this one like really egregious like Microsoft fanboy and CAD simulations. I believe you were from Romania, right? The most important data I think is that no matter how good the CPU is, in the end it's just Windows with all the problems that Windows has. Yeah, that's a very almost like philosophical perspective, but I agree. A new CPU with a new Windows version, no compatibility. Right, I almost would like, if this was like Windows 12 and it was like majorly rewritten for ARM and there were like 50 apps right out of the gate optimized for it, and Microsoft was like committing to making all their tools and whatever super duper ARM focused, then I could see it be more like relevant. But given that it's like coming out like before Windows 12, it's coming out right in the competition, as Yazin Willi also saying like that we are about to get like new AMD and Intel chips, and it's coming after M4, after M3, competing with on a lot of things with on M2. It is architecturally inferior to like the upcoming X95 cores that are built directly by ARM. It's such a weird thing where it's not just Windows on ARM, but this specific chip isn't super impressive, especially not in things like GPU. We don't know exactly how well its individual intellectual properties behave, like its media encoders, because again, with all the compatibility layer stuff, it's hard to tell. And then, of course, it then has to deal with all the Windows on ARM stuff and its own position versus the competition, right? So if it was like coming out in the end of the year and was like a 3 nanometer part with the latest GPU, it had like a 192 white bus. If it was based on either like a second generation Orion cores that were like that were 3 nanometer and ARMv9, or if it was based on like the X925 core, that would be different. But this way, it just feels like the only people really loving them are kind of fanboyish. So if I go to like Surface Laptop, I think, a haptic touchpad. Wait, where are their reviews? Windows Central. HP is gorgeous, slim, and impressively fast so far. I don't know. There was like, oh yeah, this one is it. Like, look, the Windows Central guys, and this is Zach Bowden. Is this the guy that always like shits on anything Apple related? I couldn't tell you. Couldn't tell you from the image, but they gave it like 4.5 stars. It's like, really? It's like, come on. Like, there are enough compatibility issues alone here to not justify that. Their weird decision, like the micro SD card slot here that is supposedly super duper slow. Like, its speakers, microphones, cameras are not the best. Yeah, it is like good value, but like, come on, like 4.5 stars, like almost like an industry leading product. Like, even like a 16:9 aspect ratio screen is already pretty bad, given that newer Macs are even like somewhere between 16:10 and 3:2. It doesn't have a touch screen, which I actually appreciate, but I know a lot of people on the Windows side will not agree with. So yeah, the gorgeous, like even here they had to like almost double this specific point where it's like, oh, it's a gorgeous 15.6-inch OLED display, and then they bring up the resolution and the refresh rate, which is, and they call the Snapdragon X Elite incredible, which on this device is like the lowest end Snapdragon X Elite, which I'm like, really? This one, the one that like underperforms the M2 in regular like real world results? A CAD simulation, I cannot see how this can be an alternative for the M3 MacBooks. It cannot really be. Like, people will just fixate on the fact that it's like more efficient than current Intel and AMD right now. And maybe day to day it will give you like 2 hours more battery life or whatever, but that's just not enough. You don't have the software. Well, Windows does have the software to compete with Apple Silicon Macs. It's just like, will this get not only like ARM versions of those apps, but actually apps that are optimized for this specific chip? And once they're optimized, you have to consider, well, it has a GPU that is more a competitor for the M2 rather than the M3 and the M4. So if you have even like a super optimized app that is then GPU accelerated on top, now you end up with something slower than like an 8-month-old MacBook, and obviously way slower than once we get like M4 devices. And of course, there is nothing to say of like Apple about this competing like wattage wise against like M3 Pro and then an upcoming M4 Pro. It is not an actual competitor for the base Apple Silicon chips. So yeah, I just wanted to tell you, like, there will be fanboyish results. So always, like, I always am careful, like when the likes of 9to5Mac or Mac Rumors review some Apple stuff, and I'm thinking like, well, technically those devices do have a little bit more competition than what you guys are mentioning. And sometimes they do excuse like like pricing moves that I don't agree with and things like that. But that's because not because of just a hyper bias, but because they already are used to those things with Apple. When it comes to a product like the VivoBook S15, there's no reason to give it specifically 4.5 stars, right? There are other Snapdragon X Elite devices coming out, but because this is Windows Central, because it's the first device that actually they got their hands on with the X Elite, and because Microsoft is pushing the X Elite so hard, they kind of had to give it this high marks, because otherwise it would just look like they aren't happy with the X Elite, like they aren't happy with Windows 11, like they aren't happy with Copilot potentially, which like even here it's like no, like you won't mention in the cons that like Copilot Plus isn't even like actually available right now. That's just weird to me. I'm sorry. And yeah, Kat, the truth is always somewhat in the middle, but it depends what sides you choose, right? Because you do have to be able to really say that some data is so worthless. It's no like, if you have a benchmark, right? Let's do it with something very mathy, right? And you have a benchmark that sometimes gives you as slow as 1800, but then the best Silicon Lottery devices give you like 2200. The truth is that generally you would be somewhere in the middle, probably closer actually to the highest results, at least if the thermals and everything else are all right. But you will acknowledge that, yes, some devices might perform a little lower based on thermals, based on maybe a bad just silicon lottery, whatever. So maybe 1800 is possible, but it's not very likely, right? But then if you had the same results and you sometimes had a result that was like 2800, right? And you were like, okay, what does that mean? Dante Integra actually agreeing with me. Yeah, we've been making that point all along. Not only does it have to compete with Apple, where it, in my opinion, fails except for price, but it already loses against something like Hawk Point from AMD when it comes to graphics, but it also will like lose a lot more in most results versus Strix Point and then Lunar Lake. And what I was saying, like if you then have like a result like that is like 20-30% higher, you have to be able to, or lower, right? You have to be sometime able to discredit that. This is why when the 1800 results for the Snapdragon X Elite were coming out, I was saying like, even though some of my Twitter friends were saying like, oh, you see how low it is? I was like, yeah, but this is definitely like a low power mode. What I used that benchmark for, I was saying like, oh, if it has to go this low on like a balanced mode or whatever, that means that it's probably not as efficient, and when it comes to like pushing actual like peak power, it will use a lot more performance, right? So a lot more power. So I use that performance metrics not to evaluate the actual performance, but to evaluate the efficiency, right? But if someone told me like how powerful, how performant is the X Elite, and they gave me like that 1800 benchmark, I would just say I don't care about this benchmark. This benchmark probably is extremely power limited, or maybe extremely thermally limited. It has no like, it's not relevant data for the question that you asked. It might be relevant data for some other question, right? I do some scientific stuff for my work and whatever. Then I can evaluate it, but not in the context of the question that you asked. I apologize, that was super duper wordy. That's because my tongue is putting itself into blurts after 2.5 hours of speaking nonstop. I apologize for at this point. You're probably bored out of your mind, but I really, really enjoyed this. I really wanted to cover all this different stuff. Obviously, there is benchmark data now that we can talk about. However, we do have to consider that some benchmarks are yet non-native. Some benchmarks are, even if they are native, might not be the best in general, especially when it comes to GPU stuff. And then we do still have a lot of data that is missing, for example, like proper gaming tests and whatever. So this is why we try to find at least some data somewhere. Of course, when it comes to the value proposition, we've talked about like the cheapness of the VivoBook, but then the relative expensiveness of the Surface laptop. We talked about how Apple plays into all of this, everything from like old and refurbished M2 devices that you can buy, which technically they're even still in the lineup if you want to pay a full $1,000 for an M2 MacBook Air. I would not do that. I would look at Amazon to get it like at $899, maybe like even $869 or something like that. But then obviously Apple has the entire M3 lineup of 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. They do have the M4 iPad Pro, which if you want to just isolate the chip and not even consider it in the context of like the actual device, then obviously you have to compare it to the M4, because the M4 has now been out for a month and the Snapdragon X Elite is only right now reaching people's hands. Yeah, so this is basically Yasin Vili saying, need to drop thanks for the deep dive. Do you mean like you want to thank me? Because obviously I thank you guys for tuning in and help making this stream very, very lively, very engaged, helping me even with some questions that I might have coming up throughout the analysis. So yeah, I really love doing this. Obviously, this has been the first 2 days of this coverage, so this is why I had quite a lot to say. This is now 2.5 hour videos in a row. The next few videos, expect those to be a little shorter, a little more concise, maybe only focus on some relevant data. But we also have more other news to cover, right? We got some recent leaks about the like sensors that Samsung will be using in the Galaxy S25 series and what that means for its competition with the upcoming iPhone 16 and 16 Pro series. We had Apple talk about why the A17 Pro is the only iPhone chip that supports Apple Intelligence. So there's a lot that I want to cover, and I will cover a lot of this throughout the weekend, but I really, really, really wanted to cover the X Elite first. So as always, this is my last shout out for today, my last call out for you to do the YouTube jazz, as I call it. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this. Like the video, it helps out tremendously with the algorithm. Comment please on the video once it's been uploaded for how lively our live chats are, for as dead our comment sections. Even if we get like thousands of views, we sometimes end up with like 5 to 6 comments on the video. So please, once the video has been uploaded, please leave a small, like maybe a little thanks if you enjoyed this, maybe some suggestion for a future video. That would be very, very much appreciated. Share the video to anybody who you think might enjoy it. If you catch me live, please consider doing a small donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker. And of course, if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, help me reinvest into the channel, help me free up more time for the channel so I can do longer streams like this more often. Consider subscribing to my Patreon. But of course, just watching these videos is very much appreciated, as is every comment, every interaction, every new follower on Twitter, where we engage sometimes in heated discussions. So I'm very, very much looking forward to continuing this coverage, doing other coverage, and I'll see you guys then. See you next time. Thank you again so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.